So a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and we were talking about sexual assault and rape as we've seen it on our campus. And she told me something that I can't get out of my head. She told me this story about how when she was in 7th grade, her and her Girl Scout troop went to a session on sexual assault prevention. And in this session, the facilitator taught them that if they were the victim of an ongoing sexual assault, that they needed to shout that there was a fire. Because if they shouted that there was a rape, that no one would come and help them. And I had never heard this before. This shocked me. And as a 21-year-old man, I'd lived my entire life without hearing this story. And I was so shocked that we teach our young women that, one, we don't care what's happening to them. On a base level, if we're not going when they shout rape, we don't care. And then two, that if they find themselves in this situation, they have to lie about what's going on for someone to give them any attention and to help them and to support them. And the problem that we're facing on our campus is that altogether too many women are finding themselves in this situation. The National Institute of Justice estimates that there's between a 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 chance that a woman will be the victim of a sexual assault while a student at a college in America. Now, nationally, only 40% of rapes are reported. But if we take that number and we apply that to college campuses, the Department of Justice has estimated that it falls to below 5%. That means if a man rapes a woman on a college campus in America, there's a 95% chance or higher that he's never going to face any consequences for it. Now, the conversation about sexual assault is often led by women and for women, and it's always seen as a men's issue. And there's good reason for this, or as a woman's issue, and there's good reason for this, because men are the ones that are doing this. Men are the ones that are raping women. Men are the ones that are marginalizing their voices. And men are the ones who are not holding the perpetrators accountable. But at the same time, it's 100% a men's issue because of that. And we have to realize that it's on us to start to stand up and make a difference. And so, when we think about what it means to be a man, we have to think about how that comes about. When we're growing up, we're told a lot to be a man. But what does that mean? Everyone has different perceptions of how they define their identity, but society as a whole sets a certain standard for us. And Michael Kimmel, who is a prominent men and masculinity studies researcher, wrote a book called Guyland, in which he defines 4 rules that set the parameters for what being masculine means in our society. The first is that men are not allowed to be feminine in any way. If you're a real man, then you're not a sissy, you're not a wimp, you're not allowed to act or dress feminine, and you're not allowed to even like things that women like. Masculinity is an all or nothing deal. The second rule is that you have to be successful. You have to find a job in which you're able to make enough money to show off to your peers and prove yourselves are equal. And if you're not successful, then you're going to be seen as less of a man. You have to succeed at everything you set out to do, and if you don't, then your identity is at risk. The third rule, and Kimmel calls this be a sturdy oak, but what it means is you're not allowed to be emotional. Men are not allowed to show if they have emotions. They're not allowed to show fear. In the context of an emergency, we're not allowed to panic. We must always be calm and collected, and the key here is that we always have to be in control. We can't be awkward, and we can't ever be uncertain about what's going on. The last rule is a mandate to give him hell. And it's a blank check for reckless and dangerous behavior. And we often hear this when we say, go big or go home. But we are taught that we need to take things to the extreme because that's what men do. Now, these rules, they create this rubric for manhood, and they create an identity that we have to live up to. But in a reality, if we look at the reality of how men live our lives, we're faced with a few problems. One is that these rules are not attainable. And if we attempt to attain them without being the type of people that inherently are going to be them, then we're going to run into a few problems. Because when we realize that as people we're not able to fit this role, then we are ashamed of that. And as we realize how ashamed we are of it, in the spirit of the rules, we're not allowed to show that. And so we take it and we internalize it. And when we internalize it, we give up our control over the decisions that we make, and we end up getting affirmation for our actions from other people instead of ourselves. And as this cycle continues, and as groups develop like this, we end up in a group of peers in which no one has the courage to stand up and challenge the group norms if things get too far and people start to get hurt. And this leads us to the fundamental paradox of masculinity, that men themselves are creating and perpetuating a series of rules in which they as individuals are rendered powerless. Now, at this point, it's important to identify that there's no one way to be a man. Gender is not a group identity. Gender isn't an individual thing. No one can tell you that the way that you choose to express your gender is wrong. And no one can tell you that you're anything other than the gender with which you identify. And what this does is it takes away that control from you, and it makes it a group thing. And this particular version of masculinity has so much power because it is so prevalent and we're all pressured to do it. And it has so much power that it becomes what most people call hegemonic. And hegemonic masculinity is, in its nature, dominates everyone in the society it influences. It becomes the single narrative for what it means to be successful. An example of this is different gender identities. Right? So if you're not a man, for instance, if you're born a woman, you automatically, or if you identify as a woman, then you automatically are challenging the system because you're identifying with a set of rules that isn't the accepted norm. And then you have to suppress your femininity and assume masculine traits in order to achieve our society's definition of success. And this doesn't just apply to women, it applies to all gender identities across the spectrum. But hegemonic masculinity is present so much on college campuses because we throw our young people into this environment in which there aren't any rules. There's no rules for our behavior other than codes of conduct. We can't influence what people are doing in their groups. And so the men who ascribe to hegemonic masculinity make the rules, and they hold each other accountable to these rules. And in a world in which we feel pressure to do things that are reckless and irresponsible, we're holding each other accountable to the rules of the group norms, not the rules that we put down in paper in our conduct codes. And on college campuses, there's so much pressure. There's so much pressure to perform academically. There's so much pressure to be successful after you graduate. There's so much pressure to fit in socially because if you don't, then you're weird. And that's something that you're going to be ashamed of. And that's something that you're going to avoid because no one is able to show shame. And so this pressure and the conflict that it creates within us is a huge driving factor toward sexual assault. Now, as survivors of sexual assault come forward, they're further challenging this narrative, right? They're challenging the narrative that all men are able to have sex, because that's part of this, is that we have to be successful. So if we set out to have sex with a woman, then we're going to be successful at doing that. And so when a survivor comes forward, she's challenging the narrative that we're all able to do that, and it's showing that we have to resort to rape to get it. And now we all can understand that men know what consensual sex is. We know what it feels like. If we're in a situation in which there's a question to ourselves, we're able to determine what's right and what's wrong. But as we battle with this narrative that we've been given by our groups and our peers, we find ourselves failing in so many ways. When we hear about a rape, our first reaction is to ask if the victim is telling the truth. When we see something happening that's questionable, maybe when we're out at a bar, we choose to walk the other way or look the other way, because if we were to go and confront that man, then we would be breaking the rules. In terms of this narrative, there's a need to change the conversation about it, because men are not having the right conversations about what's happening. But in terms of describing how we do that, there's going to be some challenges. One, the most important is that men are not part of this conversation yet. Women from 7th grade in their Girl Scout troops are taught about sexual assault. There's conversations about how not to be victims. There's conversations about what it is, and women are often supported in their gender identity. Men, because we are in positions of privilege, we don't have to have that. And it's a privilege to not have to talk about our gender. But if we choose as a group to realize what's going on and to accept that what we're doing is not acceptable, then we won't be able to continue in the way we are. Because the way that it's happening now is that we get these challenges, and in our own group way of internalizing that, we marginalize the voices of the victim and marginalize their stories and narratives. And then because we can't do that without protecting the perpetrators, we ask the question, are you telling the truth? Because it could ruin this guy's life, you know? But if we were to assign him the proper blame, then we couldn't go on the way we're going. So when we begin to design education around sexual assault prevention, and we just try to find a way to move forward out of this, we need to make sure that we invite men to the table, and we empower them with the knowledge and the conversations that they need to effectively participate in the conversation. Because without that empowerment, without that motivation and that understanding of why they need to do this, it's not going to happen. And I think a good example of this is bystander intervention techniques. If you've been to a sexual assault prevention course here at FSU, what we do is we teach techniques to intervene if you see a rape happening. And this is a great idea. And in theory, if we could get men to start to intervene and start to identify when situations have gone too far, it would be great. But if they're not empowered and they're not motivated and we're not able to see why this matters in the bigger conversation about sexual assault, it's not going to happen. So when we start to talk to men about this, we need to make sure that this is the background. And I'm going to end on a note, and I'm going to speak to all men in the room, because we can talk as much about education and as much as about empowering other men, and we can talk as much about the groups and all this other stuff that I've hit on. But at the end of the day, it's our responsibility. We can't live our lives without thinking about the context in which we live our gender. We have to step up. We can't watch our friend take a woman home when we obviously know that what's happening is wrong. It's time to stand up and start to confront some of the norms that we know are causing problems. It's time to stand up and tell our friends that what they're doing is not right. It's not going to be easy. But the most important lesson that we're ever going to learn in our lives is how we define how we are going to show up in our spaces as men. It's going to change our lives, and it's going to change the lives of those around us. Thank you.